Let's begin by just checking out some before and after. So we can see brush the area like normal, and then it has this really awesome result that comes out with these sand particles and dust from the source. We can click on to step 1, insert source, or you could additionally get there by going into step 1, insert source, and clicking on it from within the project panel. Now what we want to do first, since our source is already inserted, is to position it. So what we're going to do is hit S for scale, so you can scale your source up or down, and P if you want to move it around. You could also grab it too and move it around. So I'm going to hit S, scale that down, get that positioned. I think that will look good right there. All right, step 1 complete. Let's go to step 2. So I'm going to go into here, and the first thing I want you to note is that when you go into step 2 and step 3, make sure your current time indicator, this blue bar, is at the beginning. You don't want to be brushing when it's at a different spot other than the beginning. I can't stress that enough. So what we're going to be doing is brushing. And I know a lot of After Effects pros aren't used to brushing in After Effects, but it's really simple. All we have to do is just select the layer that we're working with. Don't double click it, just click it one time. Go to the brush on the top, and that brought up my brushes panel and paint panel. If that didn't happen by default for you, go to Window, Brushes, and then Window, Paint. And that'll have the same panels that I have up on my screen. Now, you just want to make sure that your settings are the same. You want to make sure on the paint panel that you have the channels set to alpha. This might not be on alpha by default, so make sure that's on alpha. Make sure the direction is on constant and mode is on normal. Make sure opacity is at 100 and flow is at 100. And then for the brush settings, make sure that all these are set to off, spacing at 25%, hardness, whatever you want, but 50 is a good number to start with. Roundness at 0, angle at 0, diameter at whatever. That doesn't have to be. We can customize that in a minute. So what we're going to do with the current time indicator at the beginning is double click on the layer that we're going to be brushing. And that brings up the paint kind of settings for us. Now, the next thing I want you to do is if you look in the middle at these 3 icons, you want to click on the toggle alpha overlay, the red one, and then bring that up to 100%. This will make the brush look just like in Photoshop, which is really ideal to keep these consistent so you can see what's happening in After Effects. So next, all we have to do is just brush the area that we're working on. But you want to make sure that on this foreground background, you have the foreground set to black. If you had it set to white, you won't see anything. So when it's set to black, now when we brush over, we can see our brush. So we just do something organic. It doesn't have to be too detailed. And then if you want to make the brush larger or smaller, you can either drag up or down the diameter on here, or the shortcut is to hold Command on a Mac or Control on a PC and left click drag up or down, which is a really nice shortcut. I really like that one. All right, so that's it. We have brushed the area. Step 2 complete. So now we can go to step 3. So if we go into step 3, and additionally you could go into step 3 by double clicking on edit step 3 focal areas. We'll see that we have an identical looking composition from step 2. So what we're going to be doing in step 3 is isolating the subject. So we're just kind of painting out what is the main focal point of this image. So for example, if there was a man in this photo, you would isolate the man, just brush over him. Whatever is the main area of focus in the image. So in this example, it's obviously the wildebeest. So I'm going to bring my current time indicator over to where it says brush here. Now I hit Command B accidentally. If you look up on the top panel, it has the clone stamp tool selected. And if you hit Command B again, it goes to this icon, which is the eraser tool. So if you accidentally hit the hotkey too many times, it will cycle through those elements. I can't tell you how many times I selected the clone stamp tool when I meant to select the brush tool. So just make sure you're on the brush tool. So we'll double click onto the brush, and then we're just going to paint over the whole wildebeest. And this does not have to be very precise. That's perfect. All right, we'll go back into step 3. And now you can see that this is the highlighted area that I have as the focal area of the image. That is everything for inserting your source, isolating your source, and then selecting the focal areas. In the next section, we're going to go over seeing the results and customizing them. All right, you guys, we are ready to see our results. So let's go from step 3 focal areas to the wildebeest comp, or whatever name you created within your script. And you can additionally find that if you go to edit and then within here to the name of the comp here. So we'll go to wildebeest, and you can see right away that we're not seeing any result. And the reason why that is because we have to move our current time indicator over to where it says edit here. And now we can see that we have our dust and sand happening from our source. Now it's happening in the wrong direction. I would like this to go to the left, and we'll go over that in a minute. But just note that the next few sections are going to be broken up into multiple parts. So this section, we're going to go over the Sandstorm Controller. And then the next one, we're going to go over the scene controller. And then finally, we're going to go over the extras and camera controller. And it's all going to be rather quick sections. I just want to make sure that you can have these as a reference to come back to later if you have a question about a particular parameter. So let's go to the Sandstorm controller first. And the first thing you want to do is to grab any one of the settings and hit Command A to select all of them and twirl them up. And now we can have a really clear view of all the different settings here. The first one is the angle controller, and this will adjust the master angle that the sand and dust is going. So by default, it goes to the right. So if we want to move this to the left, we can either slide this over, or we can drag this angle controller and bring it to the left. This is really cool because it used to be you could only go left, right, up, or down for previous buyers, but now you can go any angle that you'd like within here. The next parameter we have is the distance. So if we twirl this down and bring this to 600, for example, it will bring the dust over further. So depending on how far you want the dust to travel from your source, you can have it go all the way across the screen or just a little bit of dust coming off of it. I'll undo that. Next, we have a divider, and these are just set up to divide sections of elements for you to kind of keep things organized. So really the effect is built up from two main elements. It's got these little particles, which we're calling sand, and larger, more volumetric elements, the dust that's happening from the source. So if you want to adjust the opacity of the sand, you can adjust that here, or the sharpness. Increasing the sharpness of the sand will increase the brightness of the highlights in the sand and darken the shadows in the sand. So it'll add a little bit more contrast and look, if you want the sand to pop a little bit more, that's what I would recommend adjusting. Next, we have the dust opacity. If we twirl this down, you can see that by default, we have this set at 80%. And so there's a little bit that you can see through on the dust, but if you want it to be completely dense, so you can't see through it at all, we can bring that number up to 100. Next, we have the dust sharpness, and I wouldn't recommend adjusting this to much more than 30, for example. And you can get some nice contrast and edges with the dust, but if you do too much, it starts to look a little fake. So I would say 20 is a pretty good parameter setting for this by default. The next section we have are the levels, and other than the angle controller, the levels are probably the ones you're going to be editing the most. So I have this auto levels feature I included. So if we click this on, you can see that what it does is it kind of looks at the scene as a whole and the object you brushed and tries to guess how the dust should look. And although it does kind of match the scene better, it doesn't really look like it's coming off of our wildebeest. So in this example, it doesn't work. But it takes 10 seconds to just try this out and see if it looks better or not with your particular example. Next, we have the shadow and the highlight levels, and these are set to 0 by default, and they can go up above 0 or down below 0. And so if you go to the shadow levels and you bring it to -50, for example, it will make the shadows in the scene darker that are on the dust. So now we have really dark dust coming off of it. And that might be the look that you're going for if you're trying to match the color of the shadows in with the dust. And also you could bring this to +50, and that'll make the shadows much lighter than before. So undo those. And same for the highlight levels. Now these values will go up to 100 or -100. So if we'll go to 100 on here, we can see a major shift in the highlights going from a medium tone to kind of a really bright tone. And then the opposite's true as well. We can go -100 for the highlights. And that'll make the highlights within that dust way darker. So you can really fine tune the results that you want with this. Next, we have the tint and saturation. So if you want to add a slight tint to it, let's say we want, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. Just for example's sake, let's say you wanted a purple tint to this or pink. So we'll bring there, and then we'll bring the blend with original to 50. So this will add just a little bit of that extra color in there if we wanted our scene to have that for whatever reason. Maybe the source has a color in it that the dust isn't picking up. So we can really fine tune that. And then finally, just the saturation. If you want to increase or decrease the saturation, just like the levels, then we can go in and increase or decrease that. All right, you guys, that's everything for the Sandstorm controller. Let's go over the scene controller next. All right, you guys, in this section, we're going to go over the scene controller. So let's click on that, and then let's grab any one of the parameters and twirl them up. Now, the first one we have is the brush softness and brush opacity. So if you remember from step 2 and step 3, the brush hardness, we can actually still control that a little bit without having to go into those comps and rebrushing or editing our brushed area by going to the scene controller and adjusting the softness or the opacity. So we can adjust that if we'd like. Next, we have the blur parameters. So if I check that on, you're going to notice a couple things happening. So After Effects is going to load for a second, and then it's going to blur the background. And it's also going to blur some of the foreground. Now this is where the step 3 came in. So this area that we brushed in step 3 will always be in focus. And part of, like we can zoom in a little bit, part of the dust and sand that's being created is blurred out. And this just adds a little bit more depth and realism to the scene. And we can adjust this by going to the foreground blur and the background blur and adjusting that down. So for example, let's say we like the background being a little blurred out, but we don't want the foreground blurred out. So what you can do is just set this to 0, and then it will do its thing. And now we have a completely sharp foreground with a blurred out background. Turn that back on so you can kind of see the before and after. And I really like using this blur just to add a little bit more contrast and visual interest to the subject that we're working with. But you are going to take a little bit of a render hit with this, so just be conscious that if you're really in a hurry that you might not want this feature enabled. Next we have the contrast. So by default the contrast and saturation of the scene is set to 20 for each. So if we turn that off, we can see that our contrast goes down a little bit. And this contrast adds some nice depth in the dust that we're creating as well. And then the saturation is also set to 20 by default. If we turn that down to 0, we can see that we're back to kind of more of a base, less saturated version of the original image. So turn that back to 20. Next we have the color options, and these are all inspired by 7 Styles color options that he has in his Sandstorm Photoshop action. So if we go to color 1, for example, this is checked on by default. Let's say one of the ones I really like is color 9. So we'll uncheck 1 and check 9. So now we have kind of that more desert, grungy, Mad Max style look. And we can go in on the color opacity and we can turn this down. So maybe we want that, but not quite as strong. So put that at 50%. And the really cool thing is you can stack these filters on top of each other. So like you can have color 1 and color 9 on at the same time. Maybe color 1's a little bit strong, so we'll bring that down to 20. So you can really customize these results and make them your own. All right, you guys, that's everything for the scene controller. In the next section, we're going to be going over the extras and the camera controller. So let's begin by clicking on the extras controller and then twirling those up. Think of this extras controller as kind of like the advanced controller. You really shouldn't have to edit this controller, but I still want to go over with you in case you want to fine tune your results even further than with these first 2 controllers. So the first one is source dust and trailing dust. And I had said before that this dust is broken up, or the effect is broken up into the sand and dust, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. We have the source dust, which is the initial dust coming off of the object that we brushed. Then we have the trailing dust, which is the dust after the initial dust. And then we have this sand, which is the main sand you see in the foreground. But we also have this fine sand, which is kind of like, you can see it peeking through right here. It's more dense, fine sand. So we can customize and add more of any of these with the amount or the size and increase or decrease them. I worked quite a bit on testing and tweaking these base results. So it should be good out of the box, but if you do want to customize them, you can. So that's as detailed as I'm going to get with these settings. They're kind of self-explanatory. Like if you want to add more trailing dust or increase the size, you can tweak these settings. But this next one, brush area visibility. If I change this from 5 to 50, we can see right here that now our wildebeest is more visible where we brushed. So brush area visibility. It's set to 5 by default. I think that's a good starting spot, but if you want to see more of the object that you brush, you can increase that and it'll kind of pop that out more. Next, we have the filter animates in and out. So by default, in this particular composition, we have the effect building from frame 0 to fully on, and then it loops, and then fully on to off. And within here, we can see that if we go back to frame 0, that the effect is gone, but the filter is still on. So if you want the effect to start and end with the filter gradually turning on, you can do that with this setting. This next parameter, turbulence, twirl this down, it's set to 20, and that's a really good setting by default. You can increase this or decrease it. I wouldn't recommend going any higher than say 30 or 40 because it starts to get a little bit fake looking. It's hard to describe, but it looks not very organic when the turbulence is set too high. And then finally, we have this master emitter and master recess, and these are not to edit. They're kind of behind the scenes effects, so just don't worry about those two. So next we have the camera controller. Now by default, there's a very subtle sway that the camera does. And obviously since we're looking at a static image, you can't tell. But if we were to animate this, you'd see that the camera is very subtly moving. So if we want to turn that off, we can go to the camera motion frequency and set that to 0. Now, the other thing that the camera controller does is with this little bit of frequency, it allows you to see more clearly that there is a little bit of parallax in the scene that I've added. And the parallax is being created from the focal area that you selected. So if the camera were in motion right now, you'd be able to see that the wildebeest is actually a little bit closer to the camera than the background is, as well as the dust and sand. And then the last thing I want to go over with you, if we turn the shy layers, this button right here with the little dude behind the wall, if we turn that off and we go down to where it says step 1 insert source, it should say by default, if you click on this where it says layer name, source name, we're going to go to where it says reveal original. And I'm going to go to the eye icon and turn that on. Now by default, this adds a layer on top of your results. So if you remember from 7 Styles Photoshop action where we had the vector mask, this is how you would apply the reveal original to the image. So in this example, let's say that I want to have this to be a little bit more gradual coming off from the wildebeest. So what I do is have the reveal original layer turned on, and then I would create a mask by hitting G with my pen tool coming up, or you can go to this icon right here for the pen tool. And then I'm just going to mask out right here on this layer, on this reveal original layer. And now we can see that it did create a cutout of the wildebeest that we want, but it's way too hard. So what we're going to do is on the mask, we're going to twirl this down until we get to mask feather, or you could also on the layer, the reveal original layer, hit MM on your keyboard, and that'll bring up the mask properties. And let's set that to something like 50 and see how that looks. It's still a little bit too sharp. Let's go up to 100. So it's looking good, but it's looking like this part right here where the leg is, it looks like it's not rolling off the leg very well. So what we're going to do is grab these 2 points. I'm just going to drag this over there. So I think this looks a little bit more natural, more organic of the dust coming off. And so I just wanted to go over that one really quick with you. The rest of the layers below here you shouldn't have to worry about. So we'll turn the shy layers back on. All right, you guys, that is everything for customizing your results. So in the next video, we're going to go over the rendering options and what you can do with your renders. All right, we are in the last section, and we're just going to bring it all together. I'm going to show you the rendering options and give you some kind of ideas to get your wheels turning for how you can use these. Now we're in step 1. I'm going to hit S on this layer to scale it down, and I'm just going to click and drag it over. Step 1, done. Step 2, isolate. Hit Command B, and it's going to bring up the brush panels, and everything looks good. The black is in the foreground. My current time indicator is not at the beginning, so I'm going to drag that over. Now, since the current time indicator is at frame 0, and my brush is selected, I'm going to double click on this brush layer, and I'm just going to brush around. I'm going to also make this, like I said earlier, so it's more visible. Brush around there, maybe a little bit of this section right here. There, that looks good. Step 3, bring the current time indicator to frame 0. I'm going to hit Command B again. And I accidentally hit the clone stamp tool, so keep hitting it till I go back to the brush tool. And we're just going to select the focal area right here. There. Okay, so steps 1 through 3 are done. Let's go to where it says edit here. I'm going to select the Sandstorm Controller. I'm just going to drag this because I know I want the angle to be at a downward angle here. So, I mean, I could definitely keep tweaking this and make it look better, but for example's sake, I think this looks good. So let's say I'm ready to render it out. I like what I'm seeing. So what we do then is we'd go to the render folder, twirl that down, and we have to choose which one we want to work with. The timer map is a little bit different than the other 4, but for right now, what I'm going to do is, let's say, for example, I want to render out the hit. So what I do is I would select this and highlight it, and then go to Composition, Add to Render Queue. And now, render settings, this can be a complex discussion, but use best settings for right here. Under the output module, select that and go to QuickTime. And you can use whatever you want, but if you have space to spare on your computer, I'd recommend animation. And if you are running low on space, I'd recommend H.264 for the setting there. Select where you want the render to go out to, so your desktop or wherever you'd want. Click OK, and then finally, we just render it out. And this will take about 10 to 15 minutes-ish to render out, depending on your computer speed and the size of the source dimension that you're working with. So I actually went through before recording this tutorial and did an example with the dune buggy and rendered out all these different examples. So they're already on my desktop. So don't think that this is like instantly happening, that we have this done and now we're going into Premiere. I did render these out, okay? So open up Premiere, and you can see within here in the examples that I have each one of these already rendered out. Now we're going to go over timer map last. Let me just grab the current time indicator and just play this back. So we can see that we're looking at the hit right now. So it has a nice kind of aggressive hit. And this is nice for, let's say, if you're working with a sports video or highlight footage or something where you want some really aggressive camera moves, because this automatically adds this camera shake that's happening in there too. Next, we have the in loop out. So it's going to have 4 seconds where the effect builds, and then 4 seconds where it loops in the middle, and then 4 seconds where it comes out, where the dust goes away. And then next we have just the 4-second loop. And this is awesome for if you're working with GIFs, or if you just have like a website header or something. And finally, we have the reveal, which is kind of like a more subtle version of the hit. Now, these might look a little different to you than what they did in the demo, and that's because these are slower than most of the examples in the demo that I used. So what I'd recommend is once you've rendered them out of After Effects and you've brought them into Premiere, that you can speed them up. Because remember, you can always speed up footage easily, but you can't slow it down. So I did set this up so that they are a little bit slower than what I would normally use them for. So let me show you how to do that. If we grab the reveal and right-click it, go to speed duration and set this to 200. Click OK. Now, when we play this back, it looks a lot more similar to what you saw in the demo. And really, how I made the demo is just rendered out a bunch of examples like we just did together and then brought them all together. So here is the wildebeest that we had. So you can see this is just a bunch of examples back to back to back to back. And I did have some text moments in there, like this isn't anything that's going to win any awards for animation with the text that I used in there. But it kind of gives you an idea of how I use this by just animating it to the music that I was working with. So if we go back into After Effects really quick, I'll delete that and we'll go back to the hit. Now let's say, for example, in here you didn't want it to be a white background, you want it to be a different color. What you can do is you can select the background and hit UU. And then it should have a fill color, and just select that and change it to whatever color you want. Okay, so now let's go over the time remap. This is a little bit different than the other ones, and that's because we're working with video. So what we're going to do is I actually have an After Effects project file already ready to go using the timer map so you can see what's going on with it. All right, so when you're working with a timer map, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working with this optional element right here. So I ran the script and I just deleted whatever source I was using. So it looks like this is empty, but it's actually not because the shy layers is enabled. If we turn that off, we can see we have this timer map source, and these two comps are the same. So we can either just turn off shy layers and go into the timer map source this way, or we can go into edit optional and then double click on this composition. So what we're going to be doing in here is just inserting our footage. So I have this example right here of this skateboarder, and it's just a 2-second clip. So the normal workflow will be to just import your footage into After Effects, drag it into this layer, and you see right here I have a marker that says timer map freeze frame. So this is the frame that's going to have the timer map on it. So anything before and anything after are going to be before that freeze frame that's happening. Okay, so then you would just go through like normal with step 1, insert source, already done. Step 2, isolate. So we're going to be isolating this out just like normal with this one frame. Step 3, focal areas. And then we're going to go into this composition and edit out how we want the look to be. And then when we're ready to render, we'll just go to timer map. And you can see in here, this is already all set up for you using timer map. So we have the effect coming on, and then we have the actual timer map happening. And I'm going to jump back into Premiere so you can see this already rendered out. So it goes slowly, timer map comes on, camera pushes in, and then reverse, and it stops. Let's check that out one more time. Now it might look a little more familiar to you because I use this sped up. So let's go 150 in the demo. It was pretty close to that. And I do have one final tip I want to give you guys, and that is when you're working with the product and you render something out and then you want to go back and tweak it later and you have an odd frame or something's not quite happening, it's jarring, it's because of the disk cache. After Effects is disk cache. So what you want to do is go to Edit, Purge, All Memory and Disk Cache. click OK, and that'll purge whatever disk cache you've built up in there, and it'll kind of reboot After Effects' cache for the project that you're working on, because sometimes, especially when you're working with particles, After Effects cache does not work very well. All right, you guys, thanks again. Have a great day.